So this, as we saw, is more about, right, examining the effect of technology, right? And the effect of technology from the standpoint of how it is changing the relationships between different stakeholders who are brought together by the technology, right? Maybe they were already working together. Now the technology is changing how they interact with each other, or maybe the technology is introducing new kinds of transactions that can now happen, which weren't happening earlier, and how that changes the relationships, right? So that's the main thing that we will examine, and this is this is a must read, right? This is probably one of the most important papers that you will ever find, which discusses implications of technology, right? So it's called Do Artifacts Have Politics by a person, Langdon Winner. And I don't know, I mean, I don't know how often it's being referenced. In fact, it's given as a default reference in any HCI conference, right? You know that conferences and journals give out templates, right? In which that you're supposed to follow when you submit papers, right? So in the template, they give some example references, right? So that you know how to write the references. So, so Langdon Winner's paper is actually the default reference in any HCI paper. I mean, in the template itself. Yeah. So we'll start with an example, right? So this is an example that Langdon Winner talks about, right? That in New York, when the city was expanding and so on, then one of the urban planners, I think the name was Robert Moss. So he was partly there was a lot of like corruption cases against him, but he was also a very powerful person in this whole setup, and also he was very pro-white. And right, so people say that this is something deliberate that he did. That in many white neighborhoods, so neighborhoods were segregated. Right? Neighborhoods, right? Blacks are living in one place, whites are living in another place. Neighborhoods were segregated, but there were certain areas, certain public places which were also designated, right? Public parks, riverfronts, which were in white neighborhoods, right? Now technically blacks can also go, right? These are public places, and blacks should be allowed. But he basically put up these low height bridges which were on the main roads which were entering into these neighborhoods. Now, the problem was that the blacks would typically travel by public transport because they were economically less well off, right? Whites had cars and everything. So the blacks couldn't visit these public places, right? So it was a way of putting technology in the middle, right? And in an insidious, neutral manner. Right. Well, it's just a technology, right? I'm just preventing buses from entering into residential neighborhoods, right? Which you can say that, well, that's something which we want to do anyway, right? In India, we see these things everywhere, right? Barriers which prevent trucks from entering into residential colonies, and right, all of that is very much there. But it had a very significant anti-black also influence, which people argue, right? That was one of the decisions that Robert Moses used to do this. Right. So it's an example where the technology actually had politics encoded in it. Right. It was, and not just that, it was done with a political objective in mind. Yeah. Right. So the point that Winner basically says is that technology is often considered neutral, and which we've also been reiterating, right? That it's algorithms are objective and this and that, but that's not sufficient. Right. What matters is, right. So there are typically two views that you will see as you go on. Right. That what matters is not the technology itself, but the social economic system in which it is embedded. Right. So this is something like what Winner is arguing for, that the social and economic systems are dictating what technologies will get built, and these will have political motivations behind them, right? So just like building bridges to prevent blacks from accessing public spaces which were in white communities. So this is how these social factors drive technology. Yeah. This goes again, right? This is different from another view which says that technology just emerges from nowhere. Technology emerges from scientific innovations. There is serendipity, right? Suddenly, like Archimedes steps out naked from his bathtub shouting, Eureka, Eureka, right? And it's very serendipitous, these discoveries. So technology just comes out of nowhere and it shapes society. So the technology comes in, and then society fits in to use the technology and so on, right? So this is called technology determinism. That technology is shaping society, right? But increasingly, the view that everybody is converging towards is that actually this is not how technology emerges, right? So people have also looked at evolution of technology, and there's a very nice book by Brian Arthur. I'll probably send the link later on. I haven't referenced it here, which talks about how technology evolves from what already exists. That it's building up on some innovations that have been discovered, some scientific principles that have been discovered, and it keeps evolving from that. So that part is fine, that it evolves, right? Based on what it known, something new comes in. But then there is also a strong role of the designers, right? And how they're concept, what problems are they really investigating, or what problems are they solving for? And the fact that serendipity is very, very unusual, right? So the norm actually is that it is very directed. Technology innovation is very directed, and it is not serendipitous. And that's also what Winner is arguing, that technology is actually often it embeds the social and economic implications of that day, and who's building it, what are their motivations. This comes in two ways. So we'll see, right? So the bridge example was an example where these politics were sort of, the technology was built to encode certain politics, which were driven by whites over blacks, for example, right? But there are other ways also, right? Sometimes the design of the technology would require certain setups. So if you think about nuclear power, yeah, nuclear power mandates hierarchical management, right? And it also requires the nation state, concept of a nation state, right? Because here you need control. You need very strict control on who has access, right? What technologies are built on top of it, and so on. And this, all of it comes down to hierarchical management, right? So I'll skip forward, right? So another example that is given, right, comes from Plato, where he talks about governing a ship, right? So on a ship, you have a captain, and right, a ship can't be governed by democracy. That you need hierarchy over here, and you have to have the captain in a stronger position so that the captain can make decisions which everybody else has to follow, right? So the point is that certain technologies, right, the design of certain technologies is such that it mandates certain social relationships in how the technology is managed or used, right? So it can have hierarchical or authoritative aspects which are a requirement for that technology. Yeah. The other view, of course, also is that the technology can further be designed to mandate certain or impose certain of these social economic relationships, right? So this is where we see the bridge example, or even in industrial automation and factories, that, right, both things, right, that once large factories were set up, it one is that it influenced the practices, because now you had deployed machinery and you did not want the machinery to lie idle, and therefore the concept of day night shifts came in, right? So the concept of day night shifts came in because now you had the machinery and you wanted to operate it 24 hours so that it doesn't lie idle, and you can maximize your profits and so on. So this led to factories. Before that, there weren't these night shifts and so on. Industrial automation is what brought this whole concept into the picture, right? So the technology mandated, brought in. Similarly, industrial automation, right, also means that there is a designer who has designed the assembly line, right? The Taylorist method. So naturally, the designer is in a higher position than the workers, right? So that's where, just like nuclear power, the technology itself is mandating certain hierarchical relationships among the people using it. And it's also changing some sociological patterns, right? Then the other is that it is also being done with a particular goal in mind, right? Like task deconstruction, right? So when you deconstruct tasks, right, this is what Babbage actually pointed out, right? Babbage was one of the very first people to point out that actually, as part of manufacturing, if you break up the process into smaller and smaller subparts, it's actually good because you can then employ people at a lower cost, at a lower wage, as opposed to employing high skilled people, right? So this task deconstruction is useful for lower costs, as well as it is useful because it then makes it easier for management to impose more control, because now they have to control unskilled labor as opposed to controlling skilled labor. So, right, right. So you get the point that one part is about why a particular technology is introduced, which can have social and economic implications. The second is that the design of the technology itself can also shape relationships between people. Yeah, right. And then there are many such things that were done. For example, right, the winner talks about all of these. Right, mechanization in agriculture. Right, the mechanical reaper was brought in to make harvesting faster. Then, in fact, so this is a famous. So this is the father, this is the son, and they're largely famous because the history is connected to the Labor Day. Right, so May 1st, you would know, is the Labor Day. Now, the Labor Day came up because around, I think, 1926 or so, there was a very large, in Chicago, it's called the Haymarket Affair. There was a very large protest by workers. And that was like some considered to be one of the epitomes of labor power, right? But soon after that, labor power actually has been in decline. And we also saw how the Cold War has been responsible, because the Cold War brought in this whole connotation against communism, right? So anybody who was fighting for labor was branded a communist, and it accelerated adoption of automation in the US, right? Right. But basically, many of these things were done. So the father brought in mechanization in agriculture, and which was done so that there could be less human labor that was employed, and which also meant that less overhead in controlling human labor. Yeah, because the more people you have, right, in factories and stuff, if you have more people, they can go on strike, they can protest, right? So you need ways to control them, right? So one way is to bring in technology that reduces labor. And then, of course, there are many other ways, like we know. I mean, we'll talk about it when we talk more on political economy. But this is simple labor markets. So if there is more labor, more labor supply, then naturally labor has a lower bargaining power, right? Or you would employ migrant workers in your factories as opposed to local workers, because migrant workers will not protest because they have much to lose, right? They can't let go of their wages. They're staying in cities, they're paying a rent, so they have to earn, right? So that's one reason why companies actually employ migrant workers also, right? So those are some other mechanisms, but technology is also one factor in this, right? That's the point. Technology is an important factor through which you can control labor. And then other things are also done, that temporarily unions are busted by replacing workers with machines, and even though the machines were producing inferior output, right? But it was done specifically so that you could create a fear and you could remove some of these workers, right? So some of the stronger union workers, you could remove them, and then after that, the machines were abandoned and regular production processes were resumed. Right? So technology has been basically, the winner's argument is that technology has always been used as means of, in this case, as means of labor control. And then Harry Braverman, who also wrote this book, it's very famous, and it led to, right, something called the Bravermania. So Braverman was actually a machinist in a company, and he went through the whole process, right? He saw how automation was brought into companies, even computerized automation, right, through numerical lathe machines. He then talks about basically how one of the big agendas was actually to increase management control, which was to reduce skilled mechanics, bring in more unskilled labor, and to reduce costs by de-skilling. Right? So he showed all of this. Now, actually, an interesting angle also to this is that I've not seen anything very directly related, but even in terms of white collar workers, right? So here you were really talking about factory workers and so on, right? But even in like white collar workers, even in industrial professionals like us who are in software, similar things actually are there, because we have an increasing move toward automated coding practices, or towards managers being able to examine one is assign jobs to people. The other is in terms of, right, it's typically called productivity enhancing mechanisms, but basically seeing which developers are better on some parts and then assigning them more of those things, right? So it's all about, right, we're seeing similar phenomena of decomposition, right? So these are common characteristics, right, that you break up a task into smaller subtasks, and then you try to assign these to individuals based on maybe their skills, or you try to you try to polarize the skills, that okay, some are more high skill tasks, some are sort of simple debugging kinds of tasks that anybody can do. So we're probably seeing similar things also in the IT industry, right? So again, right, there are certain parallels I think that we can draw. And I'm sorry for all the noise. Actually, I'm not well, so I'm just taking the class from home. But there's a lot of right, birds and everybody around us today. Yeah. So similarly, right, Langdon Winner talks about other examples, right? To what extent are disabled taken into account when we're building technologies? How accessible are they? Then other ramifications, that certain tomato varieties were chosen because they were sturdier to harvest and transport, even though they were less tasty, right? And it led to reshaping of social relationships, because what this basically meant was large tomato farms or large growers were able to use some of these sturdier, hardier techniques. And so whatever technologies were built, that ended up favoring some of these large farmers more than small farmers, right? So in fact, there was a lawsuit also. Some of this research came from some of the state university in California, that their innovations are actually meant to benefit a small group of farm owners through taxpayers' money, because the research was publicly funded, right? But right, the lawsuit didn't go very far, but the broad point is that there are all these wider implications, right? That certain things might be chosen because they lead to, right, benefiting certain groups. Maybe those groups are the ones funding the research. Maybe those groups are the ones who can benefit more quickly from the research, right? And they can become even bigger, right? So these are the important points, right? Right. So the most important highlight is that technologies are ways of building order, hence capable of imposing certain kinds of order. They're inherently political, especially when they do not allow the flexibility for users to choose a particular form of political life. Yeah. Right. So the other point is that now these things are being imposed by the ones who are in power. These things were probably, the research was funded more by, I mean, which is anyway the case with research, right? Research is funded by large companies, research is funded by government. So it tends to be skewed towards their objectives. So we're seeing similar feedback effects in research as well, right? People who have the, like the union busting technique, where companies brought in these machines to displace labor because they had the working capital, they had the surplus capital to do that. And they were the ones making these decisions, they were the ones making the calls and essentially running the world, right? So to say. And because, I mean, nobody asked the workers about what they want, right? Nobody asked small farmers about what they want, or even the consumers about what they want. So this, we will look at this in more detail when we start looking into participatory design. That some of the reasons for which participatory design is very important is because it can probably guard against such dynamics that emerge, right? Because otherwise, one of the ways of interpreting whatever we've been discussing is that, well, there are all these problems. What's the solution, right? So one is, of course, right, to be reactive. Whenever you find this a problem, you try to think of a solution, right? So you find a problem in discrimination, so you think of fairness algorithms. The other is, however, that you also talk to users in advance, right? So maybe you don't hit those problems anyway, right? So if you have participatory design, then maybe that will be better.